tonight. Naturalist Nights is a partnership between the Wilderness Workshop, the Roaring Fork Audubon, and the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies. And it is a 5-week series, or presentation series this year. And today is our last one. Thank you all so much for joining us, either virtually or in person. And look forward to next year's winter series lineup when it comes next year. I would like to thank our sponsors that make Naturalist Nights possible. These sponsors provide in-kind and financial donations to allow our speakers to come here, ski the slopes, and provide transportation as well. And those sponsors will be coming right up on the screen right here, but huge shout out to all of these local businesses. Grassroots TV is live streaming tonight's talk on their website as well as on Wilderness Workshop and ACE's YouTube page and Facebook pages, and then there'll be a more edited version of it on our website in a few days. So check that out, and you'll be able to go back and look at any of the pictures and stories that we'll hear tonight on your own time. Anyhow, I'm going to turn it over to Chris from the Roaring Fork Audubon to introduce tonight's speaker.
Awesome.
Chris!
I'm Chris Daniels from the Roaring Fork Audubon. Roaring Fork Audubon is here to promote the enjoyment, conservation, and understanding of birds in the Roaring Fork Valley and their habitats. If you haven't heard of us, check us out, roaringforkaudubon.com. But much more important than that is I'm here to introduce Arvind Panjabi. He is a senior scientist at the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies and has spent his career advocating for bird conservation in North America and down in Mexico and Latin America. He also works with Partners in Flight, coordinating various agencies around the world on bird conservation efforts. But most importantly, what he's going to talk about tonight is he was co-author publishing a landmark paper in Science magazine in 2019 about the decline in bird life in North America. So without further ado, Arvind, have at it, man.
Thank you. All right, let's see if I can, oops. There we go, just switch presentations here. There we go. Thank you all for coming. It's so great to see all of your faces here, and gosh, isn't it great to be able to be together again? Really honored to be here. Really appreciate the invitation to come speak. This place is near and dear to my heart. Actually, back in the 90s, I got my start in my career in field biology here in the Roaring Fork Valley, among other places, but did several field seasons here working for the Environmental Research Group, Environmental Research Group back in 1995, and then in 97 I was working for the Wilderness Workshop. So it's kind of like coming home here to speak, and I've been at the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies now since 2000, so going on 22 years. And excited to share the work that we've been doing, to track our bird populations and talk about a few other things. And one thing, a recurring theme that I'd like to promote is, again, birds are just, one facet of the ecosystem, but they really are an indicator of so many other species. And even for the health of our own environment, the human environment, birds are very good indicators. And we'll see some examples of that tonight and how what's happening to our birds might reflect on what's happening to ourselves as well. So as Chris mentioned, in 2019, we published a study in Science magazine, and it was about the decline of the North American Avifauna. It's not a happy topic, but it's something that needed to get out there. So tonight I'll be talking a little bit about this. How do we know that this has actually occurred? I'll talk about the methods and the science behind the study. I'll also talk about some of the results and the patterns of declines that we've observed, and talk about the winners and losers. There are some winners. And I'll just touch a little bit on the drivers of declines. In a general way, we did not address drivers specifically in our study. That would be a whole nother study, and one that unfortunately we can't really do scientifically yet, because it's very difficult to link large-scale population changes to specific events happening on the ground. But we do have a pretty good sense of what is impacting our bird populations. Then we'll get into a little bit about how bird populations are faring here in Colorado and throughout the Rocky Mountain West, and even get into some local specifics here with the White River National Forest. I'll describe our Imbcr bird monitoring program. This is one of our key programs at the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies that we've been implementing for over a decade now. I will talk about the die-off of birds from 2 falls ago. If you all recall, there was a massive die-off of fall migrants. Many reports from Colorado, especially New Mexico, but several other states from Nebraska to Arizona, and talk a little bit about what some of the impacts of that might have been. Again, it's very hard to measure specifically because that event happened so quickly, and nobody was prepared to go out and actually document it scientifically. There were lots of anecdotal observations, but we'll look at some of the impacts from our science on bird populations over the last couple of years. And we'll talk about some of the species in Colorado that really are of concern, that we need to be thinking about, what are some of the specific drivers of their declines and how we can address those. And I'll also promise to touch on a few bright spots. There are some reasons for hope. I'll also get into some conservation success stories, things that you might have already heard about, but to demonstrate how we can actually reverse population trends of birds. And I'll talk about some of the programs we do, and as well as some national conservation initiatives and funding programs and legislation that's currently pending. So, how many of you are familiar with the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies? All right, just a few. Well, we are a Colorado-based organization founded in 1988 as the Colorado Bird Observatory. We've since changed our name twice to better reflect what our mission has always been, which is the conservation of birds and their habitats through an integrated approach of science, stewardship, and education. And our work radiates from Colorado and the Rocky Mountains and Great Plains down through Mexico and Central America. I'm going to take you back to a moment in time. Some of you may remember when Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring first came out and first shed light, really sort of sounding the alarm about bird population declines. Much of the evidence for her book came from studies she had done locally on bird populations and the declines she had detected back in the 60s. Rachel Carson had a good friend by the name of Chandler Robbins, who worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service at the time. And when her book came out, he had the vision to set up the North American Breeding Bird Survey, which is a voluntary program that operates across the United States and southern Canada, and has been the main source of information on our bird populations continentally and at smaller scales as well. So these are types of information that's generated from the Breeding Bird Survey, trends of birds at both continental and local scales. So there have been several studies of bird population trends. In fact, Chandler Robbins published a paper in 1989 that was the first analysis of breeding bird survey data that showed declines in 156 species of neotropical migrants. That's roughly a quarter of all the birds in North America. So again, that was bringing attention to what was happening to our birds. And there's since been other studies. This is from a recent State of the Birds report that shows combined population trends for birds in different biomes. And you can see the negative trends there down at the bottom, in particular grasslands, arid lands, forest birds, and then the one bright spot there of birds that have been increasing are wetland birds. But what we've never been able to answer with these types of data and information is, are we losing more birds than we're gaining? Because we know that some species have increased while others have decreased. So this was the question that sort of set us off on this quest to understand how has the total abundance of bird populations in North America changed as a result of these trends. So to do that, we had to compile data from a number of different sources on both population size and population trend. And we relied on long-term data sets that were collected in a standardized, systematic way, and that covered the majority, if not the entirety, of bird species ranges. Some of you may have participated in some of these programs, like the Breeding Bird Survey. In fact, when I was here in 95 or 97, I did a Breeding Bird Survey route with Linda Vidal. That was actually the first time I did a Breeding Bird Survey route, but now I run a few of them back in my area around Fort Collins. Christmas bird counts, maybe you've participated in that as well. A great citizen science effort that's been going on since around the turn of the last century, 1900. And then we use some other species-specific surveys, such as waterfowl surveys, Arctic geese surveys, migratory shorebird surveys, and a few other individual species-specific surveys. In the end, we were able to compile population and trend data for 529 species in North America. That's about 75% of the bird species found in North America, but it represents about 95% of the total number of birds in North America. So we really covered most all the birds on the continent in this study. So again, we relied on surveys like the Breeding Bird Survey to generate population estimates, something that had never been done before. Actually, that preceded this work a little bit, but we used the Breeding Bird Survey data to generate population estimates for around 430 species of birds. And then the other species of birds we took from other reports like the U.S. Shorebird Population Conservation Plan and the North American Waterfowl Management Plan and some other reports on population size. Combined those with the trends from these same surveys, put that into a hierarchical model of population change, and generated results at the biome and species group level for all 529 species. But we didn't want to stop there because we wanted to be certain that what we were seeing on the ground was actually true. And so we wanted to have a completely independent data set to corroborate what we were seeing on the ground. So we turned to weather radar data, specifically Doppler weather radar. And so what you're seeing here on this map, each of those bright spots that emerges, those are birds taking off from the ground at night around these Doppler weather radar towers, and they get picked up just like rainfall or insects, but because they're a little larger, they give a unique reflectivity signal that allows one to distinguish them from rain or insects or even bats. And the Doppler weather radar technology has really improved our ability to discriminate between birds and other objects in the air. So we combined data from 143 NEXRAD weather stations across the US. This was a huge data set that required supercomputers to analyze. And one of our co-authors, Adrian Doctor at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, was able to estimate the total cumulative volume of bird migration over the entire spring season in each year. Now we could only go back to about 2007. Oops, I must have skipped something. We could only go back to about 2007 for this weather radar data, so it's a shorter period of time than the Breeding Bird Survey data. And so what we did was basically add up all the data from these stations each year and looked at the total change across all the stations across the 11 years that we were able to look at this. And now I'll get into the results from that. So, as the title of my talk gave away already, we discovered a net population loss of 2.9 billion birds since 1970. So that was both staggering and sobering. And again, that's a net population loss. So there were more birds lost, but we gained some other birds. And this represents a total reduction of 29% of our avifauna from 1970. And more than 300 species showed a significant population decline over this period. When we broke this out by the various groups that we looked at, such as the major biomes, we could see that grassland birds in particular have been especially hard hit, suffering a 53% loss of abundance. More than half of all grassland birds have disappeared just since 1970. These are the birds primarily that breed in the prairies, like in eastern Colorado, but also in the Intermountain West and in the eastern United States. Shorebirds was another group, although a small group of birds with relatively few birds compared to songbird populations, but they showed the next steepest decline. And then after that was the boreal forest birds, showing a 1/3 decline over the 50 years. And surprisingly, western forest birds, the ones that live right around here, showed also nearly 30% decline. So there were some surprising results in there. And that's the relative change. If you look at the graph on the right here, that's the absolute change. And so you can see in the grasslands, we lost about 720 million birds over the last 50 years. In the boreal forest, about 500 million birds lost. In the western forest, about 480 million birds lost. And the bright spot, that line on the top there, are the wetland birds. We saw a gain there of about 20 million. Now, much smaller number overall, but in general, wetland birds have much smaller population sizes than upland land birds. And when we break this out more finely by taxonomic bird families, we can see that there are some winners and losers. And note that there were 3.2 billion birds lost in total, and 250 million birds gained over this period, so the net loss of 2.9 billion. If you look at this wheel on the left there, you can see which groups of birds were particularly hard hit. And you'll notice the sparrows. These are the American sparrows, not our house sparrow that you see in the cities and towns, but our native sparrows, wood warblers, and blackbirds, surprisingly. These three families of birds made up more than half the birds lost. And there were, I think, 38 other families of birds that also showed losses. And there were, I believe, 10 families of birds that showed gains. And that's over on the right there. And in particular, the ducks and geese and raptors. Now, those birds have had wetland protection since about 1980. And with the removal of DDT, just like the bald eagle has recovered, so have many other raptor populations. So that was not a particular surprise to see that. But one surprise that was in this group were the virios. Virios as a whole, as a group, showed a significant increase across the country, driven in large part by this virio, the red-eyed virio, which has been doing very well. But a bit of a mystery there, and we can take any questions on that later, talk about it. But one of the surprising results was that more than 50% of the loss was made up by 10 of the most abundant species. These are familiar birds like the horned lark, dark-eyed junco, savanna sparrow, red-winged blackbird, all very widespread as well across the country. So numerically, they represented a very large percent of the overall bird population. Another surprising result was that another large group of these birds that we've lost are introduced exotic species, like the house sparrow and the starling and the pigeon. These are birds that arrived through the help of humans and have since increased and spread across the whole country, but over the last 50 years, they're showing significant population declines as well. And in their native ranges, these birds are also declining, so perhaps not too surprising. Now, the results of the weather radar analysis more or less mirrored what we were seeing on the ground. These circles you see on the map here, the red circles represent declines. The size of the circle represents the magnitude of the decline, and whether they're hollow or solid, the hollow ones reflect more uncertainty around the declines in those areas. And like I said, we just looked at spring migration because this is a much shorter period, and we were most interested in looking at breeding bird populations, because so those are the birds that are coming back to nest. In the fall, there's many more birds that leave because they've reproduced and multiplied. So we looked just at spring passage over these 11 years, and what we found was the declines were, did that come up? Yeah, mostly east of this gray shaded area, the statistically significant declines. So in the central and eastern United States, the trends in the west were either too variable or too weak. Now we do have some limitations with radar data in the west too, because we have mountains that get in the way and can obstruct the radar signals. When we look at so we created this trend surface map and combined that with the biomass passage data to look at loss of aerial biomass aloft at night in the spring across the entire eastern United States. And then we broke this out by the flyways. These are kind of geopolitical regions set up mainly for waterfowl conservation, but many other birds do follow their migratory paths in those areas as well. And what we found was that the trends were most significantly negative in the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways, and Central Flyway and Pacific flyways did not show the same decline, statistically significant declines. While there were local declines, on the whole, there weren't any significant declines. But when we look at this combined across all the regions, we saw a net loss of 13.6% in that aerial biomass. And that comes down to an annual rate of decline of about 1.5%, which was very similar to what we were seeing in the ground survey data. So why does this all matter, right? We still have a lot of birds. Birds are still common. Well, there's a few reasons. One is that species decline before they become endangered or extinct. And so we have an early warning here to do something about it. Also, birds play key roles in our ecosystems for maintaining forest health and grassland health. They are prolific consumers of insects and insect pests that defoliate trees and cause disease in trees. So in addition to the pollination services that birds provide and seed dispersal, they are key actors in our ecosystems. And without them, these processes and relationships begin to unravel. Another thing is that we are at risk of losing the spectacle of migration. I'm not sure how many of you have witnessed bird migration happening, but there's many different ways you can see that. In your backyard, suddenly there's all these birds that weren't there, or you may have seen, huge flocks of ducks and geese or cranes migrating, but we're at risk of losing that, especially for our songbirds. And many of our backyard birds, as you saw, these birds are not just birds found in remote places, but these are birds that live around us in our daily lives. Another concern is that this creates this shifting baseline syndrome, right? I mean, people growing up today might not realize that there are a lot fewer birds today than there were 50 years ago, and that there was a time when birds were abundant and you could go out and see birds just about anywhere, in every bush during migration. That doesn't happen anymore, but this type of study helps document that. And as I said before, birds are the canary in the coal mine. So what affects the birds eventually comes back to affect us, especially for these birds that live around us that are declining, right? These backyard birds and farmland birds. These are birds that are very much entwined with our lives. So one of our goals as bird conservation is just to keep common birds common, right? It's not just the rare and threatened species that we need to be worried about. It's these widespread common birds. So the drivers of decline, again, we didn't specifically get into this, but they are, at a large scale, they are rather obvious, right? Habitat loss continues to be the major threat to birds, and this is happening due to our changing agriculture and expanding agriculture. Our agricultural footprint is growing every year, and we're doing things differently than we used to. No more tree rows and hedgerows in the farm fields. It's becoming monocultures that don't support other life. And of course, deforestation, especially in the tropics, is a big concern. as is the urban sprawl, which is affecting areas around where we live. But there are other sources of mortality that are also contributing to bird population declines. From some other studies that have done recently, we've recently identified that roughly 2.4 billion birds a year are being killed by outdoor cats in just the United States alone, right? And so you might ask first, well, wait a minute, 2.9 billion birds lost over 50 years and 2.4 billion birds lost every year. How do those numbers equate? Well, first off, the 2.9 billion birds, these are breeding birds, adult birds that are being lost from the bird population. Many of the birds killed by cats are young birds, and as I mentioned before, our bird population grows each year after the birds reproduce. So at the end of the summer, we may have 3 to 4 times as many birds as we have now. So we estimate now that there are around 9 to 10 billion birds continentally, but at the end of each season, we have 3 to 4 times that. Another important concern affecting birds are window strikes. And of course, these were first most well known from collections of birds made in the cities where birds are striking windows at night while they're migrating. But actually, the largest component of window strike mortality comes from homes. And I'm sure we've all experienced that awful feeling when you hear that thud hit the window and you're like, oh, darn, something just hit the window, and you go out and you find a dead bird, right? That all adds up to around 200 million birds. Still a drop in the bucket compared to the effect of cats. And lastly, collisions with towers and structures like wind turbines. These are an important source of mortality as well, but on the whole, a much smaller component of what we're losing from other sources. All right, so these threats do not act alone because birds travel. They may be exposed to pesticides in one area, habitat fragmentation and changes in predator communities in other areas, as well as collision with objects during migration, right? And then on top of that, birds are dealing with climate change, which exacerbates all these threats, but also trumps them in many ways because climate change is pervasive and widespread and impacts birds in far-flung places. You may remember this storm we had in the fall of 2020, right? It was summertime still. Fires were burning across the west. We were having extremely hot dry spells in Colorado. And then all of a sudden, here comes this cold front out of the north, right during the peak of migration, that dropped temperatures down to below freezing. It was in the teens and 20s. We had heavy snow and rain and extreme winds. And so to understand how this might have affected our bird population, I'll first give you a little primer about western bird migration. So if you look at that polygon there in western North America that I drew on there, we estimate around 2.7 billion breeding land birds in that area. But again, in the fall, there's many more coming south after they finish reproducing. These are primarily insectivorous birds that need insects in order to fuel their migration, and they migrate at night. And the fall migration is more protracted than the spring migration, so it starts in July with some species beginning to leave already then, and other species not leaving or arriving here until December. And again, but that peak passage with the majority of species occurs in early to mid-September, right about when this storm hit. So I'll take you back to right before the storm. You can see that there were strong winds coming from the north. Cornell's Birdcast website had predicted around 400 million migrants would be traveling through this area at the time. There were fires and smoke across the Intermountain West, and you can see that there was no wind occurring there. I don't know if you remember how hot and dry it was. I was actually driving back from Durango to Fort Collins that day, and it was just thick smoke everywhere. So little airflow and extreme heat. Oops, I think I missed one there. By Monday evening, still before the storm hit, let's see if I can get this thing working. these winds were intensifying and funneling birds into Colorado. You can see that convergence zone, and that little dot in the middle there. I don't know if that's showing up. It is, yeah. That is Boulder, Colorado, just for reference point there. Now, Tuesday morning, this was really when the storm was starting to hit. The snow was coming in, and again, you can see that convergence zone of the winds there right around the Front Range of Colorado and southern Colorado. Here we are at the morning of the storm. You can see that converging wind pattern is moving south, and smoke that is all being blown offshore and down south. And then again, this pattern, wind pattern, continues to move south. The winds are intensifying. 6 p.m. on Tuesday. This was probably during the peak of the storm in Colorado anyways. But those winds, strong winds, have moved to the south and into New Mexico. Again, that wind pattern pushing south. You can see the birds being funneled in both from the east and that convergence zone down there now in southern New Mexico. And that cold front kind of stalled out there. And you can see this is the day after the storm. You can see the smoke emerging from the Cameron Peak fire already. Fortunately, I don't know what we got, about 8 inches of snow, I think, did not put out the fires. Anyways, in the days that followed this event, there were many reports and photos posted online and social media, and eventually in the news media as well, of dead birds being found all over, especially in Colorado, but also New Mexico, Nebraska, Arizona. Lots of speculation and chatter online about what was going on, what was driving this mass die-off that people were witnessing, and also how many birds were being killed. We had no idea. Everyone was sort of trapped in their homes during the storm, so not many people were actually out and about looking for birds. And we also wondered whether this was related to earlier events. There had been mortality events reported before the storm in New Mexico specifically. And around this time, the Southwest Avian Mortality Project formed to help track all these sightings and reports. Two of the reports that were particularly shocking was from White Sands Missile Range in southern New Mexico, right where you saw that convergence zone. But around 300 dead birds there were collected by staff at the missile range, including about 80 to 100 before the storm hit. Wide variety of species, all migrants, and these birds were actually sent in for necropsy because at the time people were wondering whether the smoke from the fires was affecting these birds, since they have to breathe the air as they travel. But the results came back negative for smoke damage to the lungs, but what they did find was that all the birds were emaciated. A similar report came during the storm out of Velarde, New Mexico, just north of Santa Fe. They collected 305 birds at a single site there, primarily violet green swallows, but also a large number of Wilson's warblers and a smattering of other aerial insectivores. They collected these birds, weighed them, and found again that all these birds were emaciated, weighing about 2/3 of their normal weight. I'm going to play just a little video from Velarde, New Mexico. This is the discovery.
I have no idea.
So all the birds were in a very small area. They didn't have to go far to find these birds. Well, this is the only actual documentation of dead birds being found that I'm aware of. Before the storm, as I was saying, there was this extreme drought happening. If you look, almost the entire western United States and northern Mexico was in abnormally dry to exceptional drought. And so this meant that refueling sites for birds that were migrating from further north and trying to leave were in poor condition, and birds were probably struggling to get enough food to fuel their migration. So what likely transpired was that we had this widespread drought and birds were arriving in poor condition. That's why the birds from New Mexico were emaciated already before the storm. Then we had this extreme weather event that the birds just couldn't handle. And it happened during the peak of migration when tens of millions of birds are passing through our area. And then those wildfires, if they didn't affect birds directly, they may have forced birds to leave their breeding grounds early. Young birds especially that weren't prepared to leave, weren't ready. And that smoke in the air may have also funneled birds away from the fires to other areas that were safer, causing them to concentrate in those areas. So, what has been the impact of that? Of course, it's a very complex picture because the birds that were here are not just Colorado birds. They may have come from any number of places. We try to look at this using our Imbcr program. This is Integrated Monitoring and Bird Conservation Regions that I mentioned earlier before. This is a partnership-driven, multi-scale, primarily a land bird monitoring program that we currently operate in all or parts of 15 states. Our goal is to get complete coverage of bird conservation regions. These are ecologically similar regions that have similar bird communities so that we can assess population changes at the scale of populations. And currently we have complete coverage in the shortgrass prairie region, the Badlands and Prairies region in the northern Great Plains, and we have pretty good coverage of the northern Rockies and the southern Rockies, but not into Arizona, and we have also good coverage in the Great Basin. But I'm going to be talking primarily about our work in Colorado and the northern Rockies. This is a similar type of program to the Breeding Bird Survey, but differs in a number of respects. It's a grid-based stratification, so we lay a grid out across all of our area and randomly using an algorithm that ensures a spatially balanced sample, select these 1 kilometer grids as a sampling unit, and then within them we do 16 point counts that are equally spaced out to represent that 1 kilometer grid cell. And there's nested strata at different levels, so we can look at trends at, for example, an individual national forest, all the way up to that bird conservation region scale. Yeah, as I mentioned, the field methods, so we do 6-minute point counts. Breeding bird survey is 3 minutes. We found that 6 minutes is optimal for detecting as many species as possible within a reasonable amount of time. Beyond 6 minutes, the accumulation curve starts to level off in terms of the number of birds detected. And we collect some vegetation data as well at those points. The primary outputs from this program, density, trend, abundance, and occupancy. I'm going to focus on these first three. And I'm going to focus primarily on Colorado. I'll get into some results from some other places. This is Colorado on the right side of the map, or the screen there. And you can see that sort of dividing line between the mountains and the eastern plains. And you'll notice we've divided these up into different substrata as well. And all the different overlays, as we call them, like for example in the White River National Forest is one of our overlays. And so I'll be getting into some of that data as well. So when we looked at population changes in that western part of Colorado between 2020 and 2021, remember the storm was in fall of 2020, we saw that 47 species decreased in density with an average decline of about 22% in those 47 species. But on the other hand, we saw that 42 species had increased density in this same time period and by a similar average amount. So it kind of sounds like a wash, right? But when you change that to abundance by multiplying the density times the area, we see that we lost around 5.6 million birds from our Colorado breeding bird population of those 47 species. And we gained from the increasing species about 4.6 million. So there was a net loss of about 1 million birds from our Colorado breeding population. I decided to look at this a little more closely and divide these birds up into different types of migrants, right? There are migrants that largely leave early. There are migrants that are leaving or passing through, sort of during that peak period. And then we have the later migrants that either depart later or come through later. And then, of course, we have resident birds as well. So I thought I'd break these birds up into those groups to see if some groups of birds were more affected than others. My hypothesis was that the early migrants would have fared better since most of them would have left. And sure enough, there were fewer early migrant species that declined than that increased. With the peak migrants, we saw the opposite. There were more species that declined than increased. And with the late migrants, again, there were more species that declined than increased. And with the residents, it was closer to 50-50, but a few more that had increased. So it still kind of sounds like not a big deal, really. But and I should mention again that this is not establishing a causal relationship. Unfortunately, we can't do that. There's just no way to link what happened to these changes. But it's still interesting to look at these changes. And I don't know how familiar you all are with bird codes, 4-letter codes that are developed by biologists to help them not have to say, yellow-rumped warbler a million times a day. So the codes basically follow a system of where if it's a 2-named bird, like Gray Virio, you take the first 2 letters of the first name, first 2 of the last name. So we have Gray Virio, Cliff Swallow. When it's a longer name, like Black-chinned Hummingbird, you take the first letter of each of the first 2 names and the first 2 letters of the last name. Anyways, just did this shorthand so you could see maybe a few of the species you might recognize as either ones that decreased or increased. But there's a better way to look at this on a species level. So I wanted to look at a few different species trends and see how 2021, which was after the storm, compared with data beforehand. And start with the blue-gray gnatcatcher. This is a species that's generally been increasing in Colorado. Had an actual positive trend before 2021 happened. So you can see 2021, fairly minor but still significant drop in density, and that actually changed the trajectory of this trend. So there's about a 16% loss in that species, meaning we lost about 266,000 blue-gray gnatcatchers from Colorado. Now they are one of the later migrants. And when we looked at Wyoming, we saw a similar pattern. Now, again, these birds come through Colorado probably around that same time. And this is, again, a species that had been increasing strongly in Wyoming as it has been expanding its range. But notice in 2021, it dropped significantly there as well. You add these 2 changes up in just our 2 states there, we lost about 320,000 blue-gray gnatcatchers. A different species with a different trajectory. This is a bird that's been declining for a number of years in Colorado for unknown reasons, really. The black-throated gray warbler. The long-term trend, or the long-term since 2008, of nearly 4% per year. But in just 2021, it dropped 30%. And again, this is probably one of those peak migrants that was just departing. Some of the birds may have left, some of the birds were probably still here. So that's why these things aren't so clear-cut, because birds don't just all get up and leave at the same time. Look at a couple other neotropical migrants. Dusky Flycatcher. It, up until 2021, had a stable or slightly increasing trend, but now with 2021 added, it dropped about 16% last year, and a loss of abundance in Colorado of about 120,000 birds. But I decided this is a bird that goes quite a bit further north here, so I decided to look at what was happening in Wyoming and Montana in the Rocky Mountain regions there, and sure enough, it dropped in density as well there. And of course, those birds were passing through here at about that same time. Montana, in particular, lost about 350,000 dusky flycatchers from its breeding population there. Together, these are over 500,000 birds from just one species that we lost for possibly other reasons, but it's likely that the storm had some impact on these birds as well. I was surprised to see that there were several resident species that showed a similar pattern of decline between 2020 and 21. Here's the canyon wren, a bird that up until 2021 had a relatively stable trend in Colorado. But in just 1 year, we lost 61% of the population in Colorado. Golden crowned kinglet was another bird, a resident bird that I was surprised to see such a sharp drop in density. It had also been increasing, for a number of years and still has a statistically positive trend. But you can see 2021, the bird took a big hit. In Colorado, lost about 50% of its population in just 1 year. I again started to think, okay, well, what happened further north with this bird? And similar large losses in Wyoming and Montana. In total, in just 1 year, we think we've lost about 1.5 million golden crowned kinglets. The bird of our spruce forests. So when you add it up across the 47 species that, or actually across all the birds that we monitor, the combined loss versus gain you can see on the graph here, and the net. So Colorado had a relatively small net change, but it still lost 5 million birds of those species that decreased. Montana had a even larger loss of around 11 million birds in total, and Wyoming also a loss of birds and a net loss of birds. And when you look at it combined across our 3 states and the Rocky Mountain regions, we lost, excuse me, I knew that was going to happen at some point. We lost 21 million birds from our Rocky Mountains in just 1 year. And, you know, of course, there were some other species that are doing well. Some of those early migrants especially were doing well and have increased. So we did gain some other birds, but still a net loss of 10 million birds from the Rocky Mountains in the United States. There are a few bright spots though, and I want to cheer you all up because that's some rather depressing news to have to process. Here you can see mountain bluebirds took a little bit of a hit as well in 2021. But overall, they still have a positive trend in Colorado. So a bright spot amid some stormy skies, increasing at about 3.5% per year. Broad-tailed hummingbirds. This is one of those earlier migrants. Most of our birds leave here. The breeding birds leave here in August. Of course, we still have broad-tailed hummingbirds in early September. Those are probably birds coming from farther north. But in Colorado, this species is doing quite well, which is nice to see because their population as a whole, according to the Breeding Bird Survey, is declining. So this is a bit of a bright spot. Same with the mountain bluebird. So these are different trends than what we're seeing continentally for these 2 birds. All right, 3-toed woodpecker, a species that for many years was of concern and was on Forest Service sensitive species lists, has been doing very well in Colorado and throughout the Rocky Mountain West, and you can probably guess why. All the wildfires and the beetle kill has really provided a boon for this species. 10% per year annual increase, pretty significant. Although you see a lot of up and down in there too, so bird populations are dynamic. Bringing it a little closer to home, orange-crowned warbler is a species that on the White River National Forest has been increasing since we began monitoring there in 2008, increasing at almost 5% per year. And they did not appear to take a hit in 2021. So some good news there. Lincoln sparrow, a bird of the subalpine willow cars, also doing quite well in Colorado. In the White River National Forest, and in Colorado, actually. McGillivray's warbler. It's a bird of open shrublands, openings in the forest, riparian areas, also showing a strong positive trend, although note that it took a big hit in 2021 as well, perhaps due to that storm. Still positive overall. And one of the messages here is that bird populations are resilient. I mean, they can rebound and they do change from year to year. Western tanager, another one of those early migrants that largely departs our area before September, been increasing at around 5.5% per year, and they did not take any hit in 2021. Now, unfortunately, there is still some bad news locally. The white-crowned sparrow, one of the most abundant birds of the subalpine, has been declining sharply both on the White River National Forest and in Colorado. This is a mystery. I mean, this bird would be considered a trash bird by some birders, right? Because they're just so common that you kind of tend to ignore them. But some very troubling trends, both at the White River and statewide. Again, it might not have anything to do with what's happening in their habitat here. It might have to do with where they go during their migration and during the winter and things they're exposed to there. Another unfortunate story to tell here is the Clark's Nutcracker, which has been declining locally. I believe on a statewide level, though they are doing a little better, but a significantly negative trend on the White River National Forest. Yeah. Chipping sparrow, another one of those birds that we consider so common that we don't pay much attention to them, but they have also been declining on the White River and regionally. Green-tailed towhee, this is a bird of sagebrush and bitterbrush shrublands on the White River National Forest, anyway, showing a significant decline. Statewide, they're actually doing a little better. But sagebrush birds in general are one of our most threatened groups of birds in Colorado. I mean, these are 3 of the most abundant species in that environment and 3 of the most kind of representative species. These species are only found in sagebrush ecosystems: sage thrasher, sagebrush sparrow, and the brewer's sparrow. And they're all showing steeply negative trends, so they're ones we need to be concerned about. And there's a lot obviously happening in their breeding habitat here, a lot of development happening. Species to be concerned. I consider them to be on our watch list. Other birds in Colorado, we'll talk a little bit about grassland birds on the prairies here in a minute, but even on the west slope, grassland birds are declining steeply. So on the eastern plains, it's a little bit of a different story, but because we have many more grassland species out there, about 30 species of grassland obligate birds that need to live in grasslands. They don't live in other types of habitats. Most of these are migratory. Most of them winter in the Chihuahuan Desert. And Colorado is especially important for some of these birds, like the mountain plover, that has the majority of their population here, as well as the lark bunting, which is our state bird. They are continentally the most rapidly declining group of birds. And I mentioned in the earlier slide about 53% loss of grassland birds since 1970. That's continent-wide. If you look at our Great Plains grassland birds, 90% of which winter in the Chihuahuan Desert, that group of birds has lost 70% of their population since 1970. So there's something even more serious going on with this group of grassland birds than others. But in general, threats are high across the range for these grassland birds of the Great Plains and the Chihuahuan Desert, especially in Mexico, where they concentrate in a very limited area of grasslands and where there's recently has been happening a rapid expansion of croplands in the deserts there that are eating up the grasslands. And there's also other more long-term problems of overgrazing and shrub encroachment that change the habitat for these birds, so they can't survive there. So, are there reasons for hope with all this bad news? Well, I do think there are. I mean, we talked about the bald eagle, right? This is a conservation success story, and they weren't the only one to benefit. But when we identified that specific cause of what was driving their population decline, which in this case was DDT, we could do something about it. We passed legislation, and that trajectory changed. Now we have bald eagles nesting all over. They've increased by like 900% since 1970. So they are doing really well, although they're still suffering from lead poisoning. But overall, the trends are still positive. They could probably be more positive. And the same thing has happened to peregrine falcons and other raptors that have benefited from that. The other group of birds to really highlight here are the waterfowl and wetland birds. This was another group of birds that we decided to do something about. Back in the 70s, and actually in 1980, we developed the North American Waterfowl Management Plan and identified, hunters stepped up to the table and put their money where their mouth was and supported legislation to protect wetlands. And now waterfowl populations are up by 56% since 1970. So it really shows what we can do when we put our minds and dedicate ourselves to that. So how do we replicate these successes for our songbirds? That's the question. We can do it. Well, we were encouraged also when we published the article in Science how much attention it got, not just here, but worldwide. It was covered by hundreds of media outlets across the world, and people really seemed to care. Caught a lot of our attention and even caught the mainstream media's attention. You know it when your story makes it into the Onion that you've really made it into the mainstream media. Yeah. So, and some other good things have come out of that paper now. A couple new conservation initiatives have been launched. One is called the Road to Recovery, that is focused on identifying those limiting factors. Just like DDT was limiting bald eagle populations, we're trying to identify what are the limiting factors for the Sprague's pipit and the chestnut-collared longspur and so many other species that are declining, but we need to identify specifically what is it that's driving that species decline if we want to do something about it. And we've raised $1 million per year to fund some targeted research. It's still nowhere near enough, but it's a start. We're also, my organization is spearheading an effort called the Grassland Roadmap to get all partners on board following sort of the same trajectory in what we do and to create formal commitments to conservation and to coordinate and work better with each other. So we've been working on this for the last couple of years. It involves over 150 organizations representing 8 sectors, from industry to governments to foundations to tribes, states, and involves these sectors in all 3 countries. And we're already starting to see some increased commitments. For example, NRCS is interested in committing a large amount of money. I forget the exact amount here, but we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a much smaller budget overall, but they've also stepped up their funding efforts for Grassland Birds and the joint ventures, which are a partnership it's a public-private partnership that are set up around the country. They've also started to team up to work together on migratory grassland bird conservation. I want to mention one of the efforts that I'm personally involved with. This has sort of been my program that I started about 10 years ago in northern Mexico after studying what was happening there with the birds and what the birds needed to survive there for several years before that. But this is a voluntary network of conservation lands, of private ranches, where we work with the landowners to protect the habitat for a period of time, at least while we work with them on improving their grazing management and supporting them in staying on the land. Because one of the biggest threats to grasslands is the change of land ownership, where if a rancher decides to get out of the business, who's he going to sell it to? The farmers are offering top dollar, and that land will no longer be a natural environment. It will become farmland. So we want to keep ranchers in business, and we're helping support them upgrade their infrastructure so that they can do better land management practices, recover the habitat, and maintain the habitat. Currently, we're working with 30 ranches in northern Mexico in these grassland priority conservation areas that you see outlined in blue. And so far, we've been impacting around 530,000 acres, and we have more demand for that program than we can supply. So we'd like to step that up and eventually make it a government-run program where the government can support the ranchers to basically do productive practices, because it's good for their economy and it's good for the environment. And Mexico in particular has an initiative right now to mainstream environmental practices into all their different sectors. So we're trying to mainstream these good grazing management practices and support for ranchers into their government programs. Hopefully we'll see that through the Grassland Roadmap. A few examples of the types of work we do, rotational grazing to try to avoid what's happening on the left there with the shrub encroachment. We do species conservation focused on the Oplomato falcon, which is a highly endangered species, putting up nest platforms for them so they have safe places to nest. And one of our main activities as well is mechanical shrub removal, trying to reverse the tide of shrub encroachment, which has affected probably somewhere between 50 to 70% of all the grasslands in the Chihuahuan Desert. And this also supports the ranchers' activity because they like to see more grass for their cattle, but this is also the habitat that the birds need. Once those shrubs move in, it changes the whole predator community, and grassland birds that remain in those areas suffer a higher rate of predation. We have a similar program in the U.S., and in fact the program I've been running in Mexico is sort of modeled after what we've been doing in the U.S. for longer. We have these private land wildlife biologists that are embedded in NRCS offices around the West and that work to implement Farm Bill conservation programs. If you're not aware of the Farm Bill, it is the largest conservation program in terms of dollars in our country, somewhere around 2 to 3 billion per year. It's an enormous amount of money, and we help make sure that is directed towards grassland bird habitat conservation and restoration. A couple policy initiatives I'll mention. One, probably the most important one, this could be a real game changer for conservation, is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. This is a current piece of legislation that's been introduced in the House, has 165 co-sponsors, including 37 Republicans, so strong bipartisan support. What it would do is it would amend the Pittman-Robertson Act to provide $1.4 billion per year in grants to states to help them implement their state wildlife action plans. And that would address the needs of, together, more than 12,000 non-game species that currently don't have much at all happening for their conservation. So it would be a real game changer. We're also working with some partners on drafting legislation for a North American Grasslands Conservation Act that would be modeled after the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. And this is currently being spearheaded by National Wildlife Federation and National Audubon. But it would do many of the things that the Wetlands Act has done for wetlands, we hope to do for grasslands. One of the other successes we can cheer about is that protections for migratory birds have been restored. These are protections that have been in place for over 100 years in our country, and it's part of a tri-national treaty. So a very important piece of legislation that protects nesting birds in particular in our country. And I don't want to leave out the important programs we already have in place. We have vast public lands that can support birds and where we can do good things for birds. I mentioned the joint ventures, Farm Bill and other programs. We have lots of open space programs. These all help to do what we need to do to protect birds. Another important grant program I didn't mention, the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act. Relatively small program administered by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Provides about $5 million a year for migratory bird conservation, primarily outside the United States, recognizing that these birds depend on areas outside the United States. So a very important piece of legislation and a program that hopefully this year will see its first major increase. We're still waiting to find out. I believe the budget just passed, I heard. So somewhere hidden in there is hopefully an increase for the Migratory Bird Act. All right, I know it's getting late, so you may be familiar with some of these things as well, but we didn't just want to put this bad news out there without having anything for people to do. So at the same time that we were working on developing the findings and publishing the report, we had a team of specialists from our organizations working on developing an outreach campaign and an education campaign. And so we came up with 7 simple actions that all of us can do in our daily lives to help birds, and these will make a real difference if we can all do them. We talked about window strikes. There are ways to make windows safer for birds. You've seen probably the decals, the reflective decals that you can buy in stores. There's also other solutions like hanging strings on the outside of your windows, spaced 4 inches apart. There's now a company that makes these and sells them, so you don't have to do it yourself. I think they're called Acopian bird savers or something like that. But you can find them online, and we could save, if we all did it, 200 million birds a year. The Bird Safe Windows Act was a piece of legislation that the day we published our report, this Republican senator, can't see his name there, anyways, he held up a copy of our report on that day and said, we need to pass this legislation because windows are killing birds. Keeping our cats indoors. This is a cultural change that may take generations, but we need to start, right? Catios, you like the catio? Yeah? Have you heard of catios? Yeah, right? I mean, we know cats want to go outside, but you know, it's better for them, and it's better for us, and it's better for the birds if they don't. Cats can transmit toxoplasmosis, which is a serious disease that can affect people, especially with compromised immune system. and it's transferred through, if you're cleaning the litter box and you get some of that on your hand and you don't wash your hands and then you eat some food, you could get toxoplasmosis. And of course, it's safer for the birds. For the cats, cats that live indoors live 9 times longer on average than cats that go outdoors. And they can cause a real problem when they become feral. You can just imagine how many birds are in this environment, probably 0, right? And I had to share my own story about cats because I love cats, and I love them and I keep them indoors. And they are perfectly happy, and they've been raised indoors since they were babies, so they don't even have any interest. I can open the door and leave the door open and go outside, and they'll just come and stand and look there. But they don't go outside, and they're healthy. We can do stuff in our backyards too, right? By reducing lawn and planting more native plants that provide fruit and flower, nectar resources for our birds. It's been shown that neighborhoods that have more native plants in them, birds do better, produce more young in those neighborhoods. And this not only can be done in our neighborhoods, but in our public green spaces as well, making sure to always plant natives. Avoiding pesticides. Sounds like a no-brainer, but pesticides are still widely applied, and now we have a whole new breed of pesticides that are so much more toxic than pesticides ever were, that are being used in our food production systems. Neonicotinoid pesticides. Some of these pesticides, their level of toxicity is 1,000 times more than DDT, if you can imagine that. So whenever we can avoid that, buy organic food. We're using less pesticides, putting less in the environment. Eating locally is also a great way to help reduce our carbon footprint. Drinking coffee, that's good for the birds. This may sound a little abstract, but actually a majority of our migrant species that winter in Mexico and Central America winter in shade coffee plantations, and they're more abundant there than they are in the undisturbed forests. But the whole coffee industry is changing these days, and it's moving towards sun coffee, which is produced without any native shade trees in the overstory, and it is no good for birds or any other biodiversity. But I can tell you from firsthand experience, shade coffee plantations that typically surround forests, they're often at the edges of forests, have incredible biodiversity from both birds and mammals and so much more. So supporting shade-grown coffee, you can see it, it almost looks like a forest, and it has that multi-level structure that the birds need, so you can have understory birds and overstory birds in a shade coffee plantation. So when you go to the store, look for this label in particular. This is the one that really ensures that it's good shade-grown coffee with native species in the overstory. There's a lot of other marks, brands out there that have different requirements for what they consider, shade-grown coffee. Could be banana trees over the coffee, which does not provide the same kind of habitat as all the native fruit trees from the forest. Reducing plastics. Yep, we know this is a big issue, especially for seabirds, but now we're also finding that microplastics are getting into our environment everywhere. So a really important topic that we're just beginning to scratch the surface on in terms of its impact on both birds, but also human health. This is getting into us as well. So next time you order takeout, it comes in styrofoam, ask them, hey, have you considered using cardboard? There are alternatives, and it's up to us to promote those with our favorite restaurateurs. And lastly, but not lastly, watching birds and seeing what you see, sharing what you see and recording it in eBird. How many people here use eBird? That's awesome. Yeah, eBird is a fantastic tool, and part of the other work I do besides the grassland work in Mexico is on species assessment. So understanding the conservation status of all the birds. And eBird data is of tremendous value for that task. So bring a friend, share your bird sightings with your friends, and let's make birding contagious. And so I added a few more here that I think are important that we all can do, right? We can become a force for nature and birds. As bird watchers, we contribute $41 billion annually to our economy through all these bird watching trips that we do. Right? That's a number that's been reported by the Fish and Wildlife Service from a long-term study they did. So it's up to us to make our voices heard and make birds a priority. The next thing we all can do is supporting local conservation organizations, and I'm sure you all do this, but this is very important because these are the groups that are working on the front lines of conservation. And we would love to have all of you join the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. I mean, we are a regional Colorado-based organization with a mission to conserve birds for all of us. And we, although we're based on the Front Range, we do a lot of work on the West Slope and throughout the Rocky Mountain region and the Great Plains. And we'd love to have you join us. You can find us online. You can sign up for a membership. It costs about, I think, $35, or you could become a friend. And there's other ways to contribute long-term as well. But it's support from people that both demonstrates the value of our organization to society, but also provides important funding for us to pursue priorities that we see as most important for bird conservation. So I'd like to think that with the publication of our science paper in 2019, that we've reached another moment in time for conservation, much like when Rachel Carson's book first came out, and that together we can act to save birds and save the world. I want to recognize my co-authors on the study from many different organizations: Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Georgetown University Smithsonian, American Bird Conservancy, the U.S. Geological Survey, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. Oh, no, look, I left the Yampa Valley Crane Festival on there. This was from a talk a couple months ago. But thank you all so much for having me. It was really a pleasure to share this information with you. So happy to take any questions.
We have time for just a few questions. Feel free if you do need to leave, though. Feel free.
Yeah.
And then I'm sure that Arvind will stay around for
Yeah, I'll be here.
questions as well. But does anyone have a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
So you talk a lot about how, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned forest fires and drought and all of these things impacting bird populations. And I know we're still early in kind of researching the fallout of that big decrease, but do you foresee, a vast decline in bird populations affecting the ecosystem or the biomes where they're living?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, as a result of the drought and the fires and the bird die-off, are we projecting to see ecosystem level effects from that? That's a really good question. It's really hard to say. Certainly they could happen. As I mentioned, bird populations are resilient, so it may just take a few good years if we get lucky. Both on their breeding grounds and during migration, no big storms to kill them along the way, and then good survival on the wintering grounds, those bird populations can rebound. So there may be some disruption, even if that does happen. However, if the trajectories continue to go down because of other events or conditions that drive populations further into decline, then we could start to see an unraveling of some of the ecosystem services that we take for granted, like healthy forests. Because birds, especially on deciduous trees, I mean, they consume, these defoliating insects like moth larvae that, would eat up all the leaves. But the birds come right at the same time that those larvae are coming out, and they maintain the balance. So we'll just have to wait and see, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned early in your presentation about sort of a big loss of warblers and an addition of vireos. And
Right.
I was just curious to, it seemed like a point of entry to follow up on what the hypothesis for that, particular
Right.
part of the data suggests.
Right. So the question, for those who didn't hear it, what is the deal with vireos, right? I mean, all these other bird groups like warblers, which share habitat with vireos, showed a major decline. But vireos have been increasing. Well, a lot of that, I think, is driven by the red-eyed vireo, which is the most abundant vireo in the whole continent. They breed across the eastern United States, even into Colorado, and north of us as well, into Montana and the Black Hills. And so numerically, that species alone contributes a lot to that increasing trajectory. But on the whole, we have about 12 or 13 species of virios, and they are all showing positive trends, except for the plumbeous vireo, which is the one that we have here in the Rocky Mountains. That's the only one out of all the virios that's declining continentally. Now, I don't have an answer for you of why all these other vireos are doing so well. I mean, the red-eyed vireo migrates all the way to South America to spend the winter in the Amazon basin. Very different from most of our birds. Most of our birds go to Mexico and Central America, but that one goes all the way down there. So could be different conditions on the wintering grounds. Now, they are fairly tolerant of open forests, so they can tolerate some level of deforestation, the red-eyed vireo. The other ones, you know, some of them are also a little more tolerant. The blue-headed vireo that's also in the east. They just have a little different ecology, perhaps, a little less dependence on intact forests than some of these other warblers, perhaps. But it's a good question for research. I mean, someone could take that on. A graduate student could form a whole program of research around that to try to identify why these vireos, which live and breed in the same places, are doing so well. Yeah. Of course, birds have complex life cycles, right? They go to a lot of places and go to different places to molt their feathers, which is just a part of their life cycle that we don't even really think about a whole lot, but of course they're entirely dependent on that to replace their feathers each year entirely. They need a lot of food resources to do that, so those are kind of things can affect, you know, one species differently than another because they don't all go to the same place for that. So birds are complex. Yeah.
Just in the respect of time, I am going to cut off the Q&A, but please come and
Yeah.
ask questions.
I'm happy to stick around.
Thank you so much for sticking around.
Yeah. Thank you.